Welcome to the Boardrooms Best, the podcast for CEOs, board directors, investors, leaders, and those who want to rise and serve in the boardrooms of public, private, family-owned, charitable foundations, and exciting high-flying entrepreneurial companies. I'm Nancy May, the CEO of the BoardBench companies, and I'm your host here today at the Boardrooms Best. Our guest today on the Boardrooms Best is Bryan Mattimore, co-founder and CEO of the acclaimed Growth Engine Company, an innovation agency that challenges the leadership of boards and corporate leaders worldwide. Bryan is one of the country's top experts in applied creativity, ideation, and innovation management. Over 1/3 of the country's top Fortune 500 companies have worked with Bryan and his team of innovation experts. Through his unique process, he has led the innovation of over 200 successful new products and services, generating over $3 billion in new product sales. Bryan is the author of 3 of the best-selling business books of all times: The Idea Stormers, How to Lead and Inspire Creative Breakthroughs, 99% Inspiration, A Real-World Guide to Business Creativity, and 21 Days to a Big Idea, which outlines an empirically validated process for helping corporate leaders, high-growth companies, and aspiring entrepreneurs and boards create a continuous stream of big ideas. It is a pleasure and honor to have my good friend, Bryan Mattimore, as our guest here today on the Boardrooms Best. Hey, Bryan, it's Nancy, and welcome to the Boardroom's Best. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great, Nancy. Thanks for having me.
So everybody who's listening in here today, I'm going to tell you a little story about how Bryan and I first met. I'm going to say, I think it was about 25 years ago now.
Don't give the number.
Well, it's not our secret anymore.
Okay.
Anyway, we met through a longtime friend who has sadly left this earth as of, I guess a number of years ago, but that was Stan Mason, otherwise known as the Wizard of Weston. And Stan was a pretty interesting magician who created all sorts of amazing products for companies that we all, the products we all use today that are brand names right from the early days of Masonware, the first microwavable cookware, which was put in his name, Stan Mason, on through to the little strips, that they don't really use anymore, but the little thread strips that were in the Band-Aids, and the list goes on from there. But since Bryan and I have met, he has been working his own form of magic in the corporate environment. So don't laugh, because it's true. And most recently, he has been noted as having one of the best all-time business books in history, and that was 21 Days to a Big Idea. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend this. Yes, this is a personal endorsement of Bryan. So.
Well, thank you, Nancy. Yeah.
You're welcome, Bryan. So let's talk a little bit about your, I'll call it wizardry, if that's the correct terminology. But you do this kind of interesting work of helping companies really reinvent themselves in a challenging times, not just in the corporate environment, but also in the boardroom.
That's true. We're an innovation agency. We're based in Norwalk, Connecticut. And so the class at cocktail parties, what do people say, well, what do you help companies do? And I say, well, we help them come up with new stuff. And typically people interpret that as new products, which is certainly a big part of our work. But an increasingly important part of our work, and this is true, I think, of interest particularly to the boardroom, is that we are working on strategies for organizations. And those strategies move way beyond SWOTs and analytical perspectives and studying the market and all the good work that you need to do at the start of building a strategy. But in our opinion, that's only the very first step. The second step is really then being creative about all the opportunities that could help grow the organization. And those could be, new business models, certainly new partnerships would be part of it, and even, of course, new strategies for the brands and the divisions, et cetera, acquisition strategies, leveraging the new technologies. All those things have made, and the increasingly volatile and changing environment has made it the case that we're often called on to do that kind of work with the boardroom.
Right. I'm going to venture out on a limb and say that, in general, most board members are not what I would call creative engines. They're compliance creatures, and it's because they've been forced into those environments because of the exchanges and what goes on. Probably less so in the private environments, unless you're dealing with private equity. In that front, then you're being driven by the financials, as every business should be driven to some level from financials, because you're in business to make money.
Yep. Yeah, and I think, to be fair to the board members, I mean, there's has been, and in my opinion always will be, a sort of dynamic tension between sort of maintaining the status quo, and that's not a negative,
Right.
sort of doing everything you can to leverage the assets and competencies of the current organization. But then there's this sort of whole creative thing, and the disciplines are so different, and the risk profiles are so different. When you have an ongoing organization, you can do a great amount of work to sort of reduce risk, and I think that's a big part of the board members' jobs, and making those sort of strategic and informed decisions is critical.
Right.
But when you try to bring that to the creative, if you will, the creative side, or the entrepreneurial side, or the intrapreneurial side, whatever you want to call it, those disciplines don't really work anymore. So your risk profile has to or your risk tolerance has to increase dramatically, and that's hard. That's hard because many of the board members have not been trained in those thinking processes.
Well, and we're also trained in the boardroom to protect, not necessarily push the envelope in a way that, as you said, is a risk issue for the company, yet no risk, no gain. So you've got a bit of this sort of push me, pull you environment. Now, one of the things that you do in the boardroom, and also with corporate executives, is something called wargaming, correct?
Yes.
So let's dive into that a little bit, because it's a fascinating scenario, and it's one that I think actually more board members would benefit from really diving in and having a little bit more of an understanding of what's going on in the corporation as it relates to building that strategy and understanding competition, and even understanding where those threats are. So if they're charged with protecting the company and reducing risk, how can you know how to do that if you don't know what's lurking around the dark corners of the alley, right?
Well, that's well said, and the wargaming, as the listeners may know, has been pioneered by the military, of course, to strategize and get ready for engagements. So that's been around in corporate America for many years now, those same models. The twist on it that we've added because of the changing environment is we do something we call disruptive wargaming. So what makes that difference in conventional wargaming is that not only do we have our clients role play the direct competition, so that if you're in the insurance business, you might role play State Farm or Progressive or Allstate, but also role play potential disruptors for your industry. So that could be Amazon, Google, and Walmart, because frankly, if they enter the insurance business, you could be out of business, frankly.
The insurance business is such an old line business that, again, there's an environment that's become a little comfortable, but then they start out, they're running on thin margins to become very lucrative at the end. And comfortable. Comfort's not a good place to be necessarily in this environment today.
Yeah, and also, I mean, if it's all about the consumer or customer, right? And if Walmart has 100 million people going through their doors each week, or Amazon has that many people on, 60 million Prime members, and they decide to get an insurance, boy, that can be a real threat. Right,
and if I'm a policyholder of, let's say, a large insurance company, now they've got me until that policy runs out, correct? So I would say that, in general, the perception is that some of these large insurance, and we're picking on insurance companies right now, obviously, become a little bit more comfortable because they don't have to work so hard to keep that customer anymore once they've sort of got them.
Well, I think that's right, and we actually did do a disruptive wargaming session with an insurance company, a specialized insurance company, and the challenge in their case was that, for the CEO, that is, the new CEO, they had record quarters stacked on one another, 2 or 3 in a row. And so if you're the CEO and you're recognizing that there could be threats/opportunities out there, how do you get people to change? It's really, really hard because, if you've got a winning formula, you're not going to change it. And so when we did this disruptive wargaming session with them, and we actually did it with the U.S. group, the international or global group, and the board, And one of the most dramatic things that came out of that, there were several dramatic things, but one in particular was we had salespeople come up to us, and there are 50 people in these meetings, right? You need everybody involved. Typically, they're 2 days, although with a board we did it 1 day. With all those, one of the most surprising things was the salespeople came up to us and said, "Oh my gosh, I am going to sell entirely different than I used to."
Wow.
Because it used to be, I'm great and I'll give it to you if you want. Now it's a much more humble sale because they recognize that the competition could come in, one of these disruptors, if you will.
Not to be so cocky as a salesperson.
Well, yeah.
Right? And most salespeople in general will look at, and I'm not again pointing fingers at salespeople or any particular corner, but they are the lifeblood of an organization. Yes, you've got the R&D. Without the R&D and the new products to sell, you don't have anything to sell. But without your salespeople on the front, how are you going to get your products out there? So can we, and I may be turning things a little different, so what happens when a company decides to unplug their salespeople? Have you talked about that or gone through those kind of environments? Because I've seen that happen before. We're going to cut costs. Well, we don't need Joe the salesperson or Sally the salesperson. We've got the customer.
Well, and of course, the world is moving towards
online and other
online,
things.
faster, better, quicker, digital, and all the rest. And certainly, there's a place for that. And part of the wargaming strategy stuff is that you do kind of recognize that the world is changing, and that you have to, certainly the HR and even the board members have to be aware that we're going to need new talents as we move into the in the next 20, 30 years. And so, clearly there will always be a case for sales, and I would hope marketing people, but
keep our own jobs, right?
But as the world changes, we did some work with a large organization with their sales teams. And these creative disciplines that we know so well and are expert at can be used to find new opportunities for the sales team. And forgive me, this is another insurance example. Frankly, we do as much as or more in CPG and finance and pharma as we do insurance. But we did some creative selling work with a $100 million insurance company, a different one than the wargaming. And this one technique, it was problem redefinition, led to a 52% increase in sales within a year. And that was an unsolicited comment from the marketing CMO. He just said, we used, the technique happened to be the problem redefinition one, but they used all these techniques and increased 52% because it got them to be more creative about who was selling their offerings, how they were selling them, and to whom they were selling them. Those were the three key features that we helped them rethink creatively.
Well, and if the board doesn't ever even understand that, and they're dealing with compliance, regulatory, and financial issues, then our belief here at BoardBench is that, quite frankly, the board needs to be an advocate for the business and also an ambassador as well. Now, we're not salespeople in the boardroom, but if there's an opportunity to open a door, whether it be a public or private company, and create those relationships on a different level, we need to know about the businesses that we're representing and the customers that we serve in order to do that well, too.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my view is that the board, in addition to all the roles that you mentioned previously, compliance, et cetera, I do think that the board's role increasingly in these times is to sort of bring in best-in-class, state-of-the-art technologies and thinking processes, if you will. Of course, I'm a tad biased.
Of course, they have to understand it first before they can even bring it in or even be aware of it. That's the first
awareness.
Step, right?
You've got to start with awareness, and then you go from there. Awareness,
the old
training,
factor, I call
use, implementation, all the rest.
Yeah.
So I think that's a valid role for board members, and sort of within a broader frame of that is as provocateur. I really think that board members in these times need to be provocateurs and say, well, yeah, okay, but have we talked to the customer?
Yeah.
Have we talked to the consumer? I realize you have this cool technology, but does anybody care?
Right. So the next time I meet a new board member, I'm going to ask, so you're a provocateur of XYZ company. I know. I'm speaking at a program tomorrow in the biotechnology environment, and I'm going to get a lot of eyeballs rolling in their heads saying, what the hell is she talking about? But hey, a part of our job is to sort of shake things up a little bit. So thinking about shaking things up, a lot of companies actually grow through not just organic growth, but when there's that thin line and they think, how else can we grow? It's through acquisition. So we talked a little bit about the other day about partnerships and acquisitions and how this kind of process really pushes the intellect and the intellectual capital and thinking about what goes on in that board environment in the C-suite on how to think about partnerships. And I have a bias about partnerships, having been through it and seen what works, and we can talk about that later, but let's sort of hear what's happened on your front.
Yeah, I mean, we think of partnerships really in two ways. There's sort of internal partnerships, if you will, or internal joint ventures, or internal project development. And interestingly
both large
enough,
and small companies, correct?
Well, I'm thinking more large companies, but certainly small companies. There could be, a few of these divisions that could be doing, servicing different clients, and they could have, quote, a professional division and a consumer division, or whatever, a commodity product and a specialized product, and all of which we've worked on is how do you leverage those and how do you organize for those? Because if you have a commodity business, maybe you're sort of that's a cash cow for you, and you're not trying to necessarily grow that, and maybe you recognize that the bigger margins and the bigger opportunity is in the specialized side of the house. But we have found that it's often challenging to get those groups to work together. We did do a session, interestingly enough, with Fiserv. It's a financial services supplier. They do credit checks, and they do backroom stuff for banks.
Like an Equifax?
Yes. Yes. But we had it was 8 divisions that came together in a sales meeting and with their senior executives, et cetera. And we spent a day sort of ideating ways that they could cross-sell opportunities with different products across the divisions. And it was banks, so the top 25 banks were the target. Well, after a day, they valued that work at $125 million. Oh. And these are sales guys, and so we really pushed them. We said,
and that's one day.
And that's one day, right? And we said, hey guys, you're you're blowing smoke here, right? This is not. Come on, do you really think it's $125 million?
Right.
And they said they did, and which is not it's not easy to say, because at some point they might be responsible for delivering that, right?
Right, because you're right. You've got to put feet to the fire, and if you're a little too bold, sometimes you go, now can I actually deliver?
So we checked back a year later with the group, the head of sales and the CEO, and they told us that they had realized $72 million of that $125 million from this cross-selling. Now you have to figure out incentives for both groups. That's a big challenge often, because you don't want to sell somebody else's thing if you're not incentivized. But that's a one-day meeting that where they realized ultimately 72 ideas that led to $72 million worth. So that's, I do think there are huge opportunities for sort of internal ventures, if you will, cross-selling opportunities. And then
that's not even going out and talking to the customer on the street or in another corporate office. And you and I both in the early days grew up in the ad business or in the consumer goods business. I mean, I was at J. Walter Thompson in my early career, and the biggest problem that they had was getting different sides of the office to talk to one another. Yes. And I think the problem is still there in the advertising industry today. But here's financial services. Oh my God,
Yeah, and
they're printing money, literally, right?
Yeah.
They don't even have to talk to the customer. I love it. Tell me how to do that.
So then, I think the other side of this is the, quote, if you will, external ventures. And those are, those come with their own challenges. Right. And we've done joint ideation sessions or product development sessions or new business model sessions or whatever it was between organizations. Now, again, there are challenges with that, because you have to, get the lawyers involved up front. But you can do it. It's not impossible, and we've done it in CPG, we've done it in insurance, we've done it in finance, and we have seen real opportunities there. We even did it with one company where we did a joint session between this company and one of their biggest competitor, against whom they both had lawsuits going. Yeah. They had patent infringement suits, et cetera, and yet we were doing a joint session with them because they both realized it was to their benefit to find a way to create a new opportunity for both organizations that they had both identified.
So maybe this is something that law firms, litigators, and mediators should actually consider doing with their customers as well, when they've or their clients, when they've come to this headbutting scenario. Instead of fighting each other, maybe you actually can turn this into a profitable engagement instead, right?
Yeah, and the lawyers sometimes like that, sometimes they don't, because the fees either go up or down. Yeah. In our work, typically it creates opportunities either for package designers or even lawyers who have to figure out how this is going to work at the end of the day.
1 + 1 can actually equal 3 or 4.
Absolutely. And I think this can only grow as a trend because there's so many opportunities now. The global competition, et cetera, means that we have to do things quicker, faster, better. And you cannot do it all yourself. No. And so, Procter & Gamble, when they pioneered getting rid of their not invented here and the open sourcing and all that kind of stuff, to me is only the beginning. Certainly open sourcing with outside expertise, but now even more, quote, joint ventures. Of course, there's a lot of this going on, but I just think the board members should be constantly looking for those opportunities and even doing creative exercises.
Right.
If we mash together our company with another company, what new business models would it imply? That will open up everybody's minds.
Well, it stretches the confines of what they're used to working in. It's also a little uncomfortable. It's putting you in a very tight place that you're not used to working. And I've always been an advocate of pushing, myself and our company here really out to the edges where we're totally uncomfortable on some of the things that we might be saying and learning more about it, because without doing that, we don't know what's possible.
Well, you're absolutely right, and you're making me think of a project we did for BNY Mellon. I can mention it, and we did several projects on, quote, reinventing banking and inventing new ways to go to market. I remember one 2-day session. It was blessed by the CEO. We had the top 100 people in that organization over a 2-day session. I mean, can you imagine the expense of that?
Oh, yeah.
But we did that because we had to come up with new ways to go to market. And it was a bit of a risk on our part. We had them imagining, if you will, joint ventures. We used to call it company takeover, but people freaked out that they would be fired, so we don't call it that anymore. we call it joint venturing. And so we had them imagine joint ventures on how they could service the customer better with Nordstrom and Google and Walmart and Amazon and all these people. And that turned out to be the most effective idea or technique, if you will, throughout the 2 days. If you're mashing banking together with McDonald's, you cannot help but get interesting new business models and new ways to think about how to go to market.
Right, or my Gucci shoes.
Yeah, I do Gucci shoes. And by the way, people should understand, the listeners should understand that this thing is a numbers game. So you might say, well, that sounds stupid. Well, in a lot of cases it is stupid and it doesn't work. But it only takes, 10% of the ideas that come out of these sessions are any good, and that's all you need. You just need 1 or 2 ideas.
Right. So we're on the joint venture discussion. Let's move over to the M&A. So a lot of companies will do extensive due diligence on their mergers or the companies that they're going to acquire, and the boards get involved in them. They look at the numbers. They think it's going to make sense. They look at it against the strategy. But then the merger happens.
Yes.
And the magic dies. And the HR tears out their hair. And everybody goes nuts thinking, this isn't going to work, what we're going to do. We're tied up in too many people, and, the list goes on. And then they don't really, as the term is, which is not my favorite term, extract the value out of it.
Yeah.
Then they start looking at ways to how they can cut costs, or they sell off divisions to say that, okay, that they validated this acquisition.
Yeah.
But you've done something a little differently. So you dove into the companies after the fact, forgetting all this other stuff and this nonsense that was going on, and been a little bit more creative on what next, right?
Well, we have. Obviously, with all the due diligence, I mean, they bought this company, the parent company, if you will, bought this other company for a reason. They saw a strategic opportunity. So that's a given. What typically often will face a big cultural merge challenge, right? And so who's going to, where are we going to get efficiency? Who's going to get fired, and all those kind of things. Right. Which is, the classic way of thinking about it. And often they will leverage the competencies of that, or capabilities or services or client relationships of that company they bought. What we've done is we've gone in pretty soon after the company was bought, and we've done joint ideation sessions. These could be 1-2 days ideation sessions between the senior leaders of both organizations to ideate new possibilities for growth. Now, obviously, there's the ones that they bought them for, so those were not ideating against the obvious things. But what we found is that when you do that and you look at the competencies of both organizations, you look at the market conditions, market opportunities, all those kind of things, different customers and targets and all that rest, that you can come up with dozens of new opportunities that where, to your point, 1 + 1 = 3. Right. And these are often unanticipated services or opportunities. And that does 2 things. The obvious one is it creates new opportunities, new growth platforms and potential. But the other thing it does, which was, I don't know if it was unexpected, but we were happily surprised when we saw this, it begins the process of successfully integrating the two organizations. And our experience has been when people, groups, teams, divisions, companies, whatever, can ideate together and can create their own future together, man, that goes so much further in terms of actually building that joint culture you want.
Right, so they're no longer separate and competing against each other, but they're working towards a goal that they both mutually share and have created together, as opposed to that's your side, that's my side.
They are, and it's extraordinary because in this world of innovation, we will never go in, we call it the ta-da, we never go in and say, oh, here's the answer. We always involve the client in the process of doing that. Why?
They have to own it.
If they don't own it, frankly, the chances of it happening are remote at best. Right. And so we want them to own it. And it's the same with these joint sessions between a newly acquired company and the parent company, if you will. This joint ideating together creates joint ownership and a team thing, and people get to know one another in ways they never could because they're being creative together. It's an extraordinary thing, and I think, frankly, any organization that buys another one should start with that because it does those two things that I mentioned. By the way, we've even done these joint things between a manufacturer and a retailer, for instance. So we had a large food company. They were having trouble, and I can mention this because I won't be specific, but they were having trouble with a buyer at Walmart.
Right.
And we did joint sessions between the buyer and the leadership team of this food company. You know, we spent 3 hours with the buyer in Bentonville. When are the chances that you would ever get 3 hours with a buyer?
And these are the customers of the manufacturer, so that's even more unusual.
They are, but the buyer wanted to be part of the process, and the buyer then, we came up with all these ideas together. Well, these products are going to be launched next month. As we did this in January, they're going to be launched next month. Why? Because the buyer was part of the process.
Yes.
And by the way, I didn't mention it, but these joint things create tremendous efficiencies. Because you're all together on it. You're creating projects together. You don't waste the time. But, one says another says another. They think about it. They say no. You go back and forth, back and forth. No, you're all in it together, and you're pushing it. You're getting the ideas. You're deciding what you want to go do, and you've got the team right there to go do it. Yeah,
it reminds me of a story, actually a conversation that I had with it was a senior HR person at a very large Bell company, telephone company. And I remember them saying in a large audience, saying, look, we've got this problem. Here's this particular effort that we're working on, and we can't make a profit on it. So instead of us doing it, we've decided to just give it to some small company to do and become our vendor, delivering it back to us. So, which was, now I'm in a room of HR folks, which, I typically don't always do, but right. Not to bash the HR, because some of my best friends are HR folks. But so I raised my hand, putting my business hat, cap on, and saying, so excuse me, Miss So-and-so, you've just admitted you can't make a profit on this particular service. So you're giving it to some small company, hoping that they will deliver it to you the way you want it at a loss. How do you expect them to stay in business in order to serve you? Next question.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Who else has another?
Can you please remove that lady from the room?
Well, it's funny because you said the emperor had no clothes or clothing or fashion designs or whatever. I think in a broader sense, that is in part the responsibility of the board members.
Yes.
They need to be courageous and brave enough to ask that question that you asked. A lot of them do, of course, but... Sure. But it's not easy when you're the only one that realizes, that there are no clothes on that emperor.
Right, you're the lunatic in the room pressing the issue. And so on that front, we talked a little bit earlier, actually yesterday, about how the board works. So, part of the thing that the board talks about, and they talk in lots of associations, that their job responsibility is to protect the company, but to protect the company for the shareholders. And the shareholders are owners in the business, which I'm not particularly 100% agreeable with that term, owners. Yep. And they're not really renters because they don't stay that long. And they're probably more like, as I sort of termed, voyeurs, because they're in and out so fast. Yeah. But if a company really wants a strong, positive relationship with an investor or a shareholder, maybe there's some way to invite them into this process in a different way to say, okay, so if you're involved in the business in some way, shape, or form, how can we serve you better and how can we work together? And there might even be some creative wargaming on the investor front that could happen.
Well, I think that's a great idea. I never thought of it till you mentioned it just now.
I didn't either. We're doing a little disruption here.
Well, there are, as you probably know, there are now dozens and dozens of, they call them software management and crowdsourcing programs.
Right.
So, Spigot, Azazi, Planbox, et cetera, they, Bright Idea, et cetera, they work with organizations to elicit and solicit ideas both internally but occasionally externally. Mm-hmm. So they could act as an interim, as sort of a bridge between shareholders and use them as, we do a tremendous amount of research in our innovation work, and so these might be lower cost and or effective ways to do research, right. Cost-effective ways to do research with shareholders.
Right, and of course a lot of shareholders, I wouldn't say a lot of shareholders, but a certain segment of shareholders, AKA activists, consider that to be part of their job. How do they go in? How do they create the relationship? We are your voice on the outside, and we know the business. They quite frankly, in many cases, they do know the business even better than some of the board members, especially in the smaller companies, because the depth and the breadth of the research that they do. Yeah. Not that it's necessarily in the best interest of everybody. Because it's in their best interest. That's what they want. But, it's a different way of thinking about that relationship as opposed to just them and us or activists, the good guys and the bad guys, white hats, black hats kind of scenario.
Yeah, I like that. I like that very much. We always say, because we always tell our clients they know a lot more about their business than we ever will. Mm-hmm. Besides bringing ideation and research processes, when we go into the boardroom, typically we're bringing in their customers or consumers or shareholders. That, frankly, is our role because we've either talked to them or done ventures with them or ideated with them or ideated for them. And so I think we're an innovation agency, but I certainly think that board members can take on that role as well.
Right. Well, thank you, Brian. It really has been a pleasure spending time with you, as it always is.
Well,
and I honestly, I'm going to say there's probably room for many more conversations like this, and we'll plan them down the road in different scenarios and different conversations as time changes, or advances and is disrupted, I should say, right?
Yes.
But
as we leverage the changing environment for a greater ROI, how's that?
Yeah, you got it. So thanks again, Brian. It's been a pleasure. This has been Bryan Mattimore, the CEO and co-founder of Growth Engine Company, and I'm Nancy May, your host here at Boardrooms Best from the BoardBench companies. Take care. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. This podcast was brought to you with the support of Resources Global Professionals, the company that delivers intellectual capital on demand to the world's most recognized companies and corporate leaders. RGP, Resources Global, the experts you want to call when you need experience to solve your business problems. www.rgp.com.